Hello YouTube. The Khajiit race has a lot of mysteries that we talked about on this channel in the past, from their physiology changing with the phases of the moon to their language, which is quite unique. Now, today we're talking about the Khajiit spiritual leader again, the main, specifically about the time in history when there were two candidates or lunar champions to become the main, which, as you will see in this video, was really a quite unique and interesting occurrence. Now, if you want to know more about the main in general, so the spiritual leader of Elsewhere, there's a video in the description where I basically cover everything about the main. I will do a short recap here, but this video will primarily cover the lunar champions. So that being said, let's roll the intro and let's begin. Alright, so as you know if you watched my video on the different types of Khajiit, with every stance of Tamriel's two moons, the different type of Khajiit or Khajiiti first stock is born. This cycle repeats itself throughout the year, but once every few years the two moons of Nur, Masr and Secunda, are perfectly aligned for a few minutes. Khajiit born under this perfect alignment are a very special type of first stock of Khajiit. They are the main. Now, the main, due to being so rare, has always been a very prominent and important figure in Khajiiti society and is in essence the spiritual leader of the Khajiiti people. But here's the thing, a main's lifespan can well be over 100 years, meanwhile the moons perfectly align every 2 decades or so. So new mains are born at regular intervals, but there can only be one main, so one spiritual leader of Elsewhere. So how this system seems to work is that a main Khajiit born when there is already a main in power gets the title of Lunar Champion, essentially meaning heir apparent of the main. And if during the time of a lunar champion's life, before they become the main, another main is born under another lunar eclipse, then that most recently born Khajiit becomes the lunar champion, while the previous lunar champion gains the title of Forgotten Main. Now, these Forgotten Mains are a fascinating subject on their own, as they usually stay out of the spotlight and silently dedicate their lives to helping the people of Elsewhere, but they're not the topic of this video, as today we're talking about the twin Khajiit, Shazza and Kali, Khajiit twins who came out of their mother's womb exactly at the same time under the lunar eclipse, which marked the first time in recorded history that two main Khajiit held the title of lunar champion at the same time. Because it's insinuated that while it's possible for twins to be born under the lunar eclipse, usually they come out one after another, meaning that the one coming out last becomes the lunar champion, while the other one that came first is essentially born as a forgotten main, since only the youngest person born under a lunar eclipse can become a lunar champion. But these two, they came out exactly at the same time, making for quite a problem, as suddenly there were two lunar champions, something which had never happened before. And the religious caste of Elsewhere, the lunar clergy, didn't really seem to know what to do at that point, so they bestowed on both cubs the title of lunar champion, figuring that either things would just resolve themselves, or perhaps the current reigning main, Akuzuri, would live long enough for another lunar champion to be born eventually, meaning that the two twins would eventually both become forgotten mains. Now, these twin sisters, Shazza and Kali, were kept in the dark about their true nature for a very long time, as seems to be customary for lunar champions, as they are seemingly told only about the circumstances of their birth at a certain age. So, Shazza and Kali simply grew up for a while as relatively normal Khajiiti children, although every adult around them, including their parents, knew exactly what they were. The interesting thing is that despite being twins, the two sisters developed into completely different characters. Shazza took after her father, who was a renowned Khajiiti scholar and healer, and as such Shazza grew up loving books, learning about history, and she became a very skilled mage, training with her father in magic. She became very patient and gentle, and was in control of her emotions, but she could be a tad indecisive when choices needed to be made. While at the same time Kali took after her mother, a famous Khajiiti military commander. As such, Kali became very versed with weapons and martial arts, and was very much a proponent of swift action. Kali grew up to be headstrong, a very charismatic leader of her people, and a commander of her men who would follow her into oblivion and back. But she could be a bit rash, meaning that she often acted without thinking over the consequences, especially when her emotions boiled over. Now, Shazza really couldn't be bothered to train for combat, preferring her studies into the histories, meanwhile Kali couldn't be bothered less by learning about the history and preferring the battlefield. They grew into two unique characters, and this was clear from the moment of them being kittens, as Kali could always be found outside swinging sticks around while Shazza was reading children's tales. This did mean that both gravitated towards one of their parents, with Kali often being found in the presence of her mother and Shazza being in the presence of her father. This seems to have created some insecurity in both of them, as Shazaa seems to think that her mother always favored Kali, and Kali seems to think that her father always favored Shazaa. But despite this insecurity, the two sisters couldn't be closer. From a young age they were quite close, and despite being often separated when their parents went on different missions across the province of Elsewhere, they were basically as close as could be, and that turned out to be for the best, as somewhere during their childhood they both lost their parents in very quick succession. As you can see in my video on the politics of Tamriel, a little over 20 years before our playtime in the Elder Scrolls Online, Elsewhere was in complete disarray. The province was being ravaged by the Khajiit flu, which was one of the worst epidemics of Tamriel's history, with many Khajiit dying in the streets and the population of Elsewhere quickly declining. The Khajiit tried what they could to combat the disease, but to little effect. Shazaa and Kali's father, who like I said was a renowned healer, was being kept very busy during this time, as he'd moved to the city of Orcrest, one of the most affected places by the disease. And he'd done so to help out with the relief efforts, and he'd brought Shazaa with him, who spent a few months of her childhood in this disease-ridden city. At the same time, Kali was with her mother and an army of Khajiit in the north, because at this time the Empire of Cyrodiil, led by the Longhouse Emperors, attempted to exploit the chaos in Elsewhere by invading the province, wanting to add the province to their territory and to subject the Khajiit to their will. Shazaa and Kali's mother was sent with the troops to stop this incoming invasion, and as such Kali spent a few months of her childhood among the army. Unfortunately, it did not take long for the worst to happen, as in short succession their father and mother both passed away, with their father tragically getting infected by the Khajiit flu, and their mother being killed by the invading Imperials. Shazaa and Kali were now orphans, having only each other, and by that I mean they had each other and a small army of Lunar priests who immediately came to pick them up when they lost their parents. Because the moment they became orphans, the Lunar clergy took them under their wing, after which they were raised in a Lunar monastery. Here they were told of their fates, told that they were both Lunar champions, with one of them perhaps destined to become the main one day, meaning that they would both have to dedicate their life to religious study and training. Shazaa seemed to deal with it better than Kali, as Kali, the one of them who wasn't in the least interested by a prospect of life of religious study, didn't really want to live at the monastery and even protested, and even Shazaa was quite angry at the prospect of being forced into a life of religious duties, but she managed to control her emotions a bit better. It's likely that if things had gone as intended and their parents had told them when they had come of age, they would have more readily accepted their fate. But unfortunately a gentle touch was not reserved for them, as with their parents' death, the Lunar clergy had to tell them who they were far before they came of the proper age, as obviously they couldn't leave two orphaned Lunar champions on the streets, considering what one of them perhaps one day had to become. So they were forced into a life of religious training. From Shazaa we learned that they both struggled with this life, but Kali especially, leading them to become even more inseparable at this point, as at this point they truly felt like they only had one another for support. And this wasn't helped by the fact that the Lunar priests apparently weren't very kind to them. Why they didn't use a gentle touch, especially on two kitten Khajiit who had just lost their parents, I don't know, maybe they just were flawed personalities. But one bright spot of their upbringing at the monastery seems to have been their contact with the current main, Akuzri. The very main that they would one day perhaps succeed. Over the years, Akuzri seems to have visited them often, getting to know them quite well and becoming someone who would become a bit of a mentor figure to them, and someone who both would really look up to, and perhaps even somewhat of a replacement father figure. Main Akuzri was gentle with the two Lunar champions, and in him they both saw aspects that they respected, as Akuzri was both a strong warrior like Kali and a learned wise soul like Shazaa. They must both have often profited from his guidance, as under his tutelage and the Lunar clergy, Shazaa and Kali eventually grew up into strong Khajiit who assisted the main and his speaker across Elsewhere. As Lunar champions, they seem to have entered into the main's service as they came of age, investigating and solving problems on the main's behalf, and sometimes even serving as his envoy, likely also in preparation for what one of them one day would have to become in taking up a main's title. It is in this role when we can meet them in the game, as in the main service they are investigating problems in northwestern Elsewhere. You see, at this time you had Javad Tarn, an Imperial commander of the forces who occupied northern Elsewhere, who tried to use dark rituals in order to conquer more of northern Elsewhere, making it so that the province had a lot of problems with Dromatra. Okay, so I feel like I should explain this. Dromatra are essentially dark Khajiit spirits. According to Khajiiti legends, very oversimplified, normal Khajiit spirits are bathed in the light of the moons, and after their death their spirits go to the sands behind the stars, essentially Khajiit afterlife. But some Khajiit who bathe themselves too much in darkness during their time on Nirn, their souls after death get carried by Demira to the dark behind the world. essentially Namira's plane of oblivion, and they become dark, corrupted Khajiit spirits who can then appear both in spirit form on Tamriel if summoned, and their spirits in some cases can take over the bodies of living Khajiit. Now, there's a bit more to it than that, but that's about what you need to know for this video. Alright, so Northern Elsewhere around this time, when you meet the Lunar Champions, is dealing with a lot of Dromatra who were summoned to Elsewhere by Javad Tarn in an effort to weaken the Khajiit and in the long run conquer more of the province. Now, at this time, he had one massive ace up his sleeve, because one of the Dromatra he managed to summon was the so-called Dark Mane. A mane from ages past who had fallen to the darkness and whose soul had been dragged to Namira's plane. His spirit returned to Tamriel as a Dromatra that we call the Dark Mane, and he was bound to Javad Tarn's will, who had the Dark Mane's spirit take over the body of the current Mane, Akuzri, after which Javad was able to use Akuzri's body in order to convince the Khajiit to his side and do a lot more damage to Elsewhere using his authority. Unfortunately for him, and luckily for the Khajiit, the position of Akuzri did not last long, as you as the player managed to defeat the Dark Mane in Akuzri's body, and they are then forced to separate again. And good all good. Well, not quite, as Akuzri, now returned to his old self, admits that after doing this damage and allowing himself to be possessed by the Dark Mane, he no longer is pure and is no longer fit to lead his people. Thus, he is Mane no longer, and either Shazza or Kali has to take his place as a new leader of the Khajiiti people. If you think, wait, isn't that an overreaction? Well, not really, as the spirit of the first Mane of United Elsewhere also appears to you during this story, and he also predicts that Akuzri, after he is cleansed of the possession, he will have to step down in order to let Elsewhere heal, as he's no longer fit to lead the Khajiiti people. So, yeah, unfortunately Akuzri has to step down. So now it's time, one of the two twins has to take up the title of the Mane. Now, when there's just one Lunar Champion, then that one champion will have to walk the trial paths before they can ascend to the title of Mane. Now, in Khajiiti religion, the Mane is destined to walk 3 paths in life before becoming Mane. First is the life path, before they become Mane, where they spend their life growing, loving and learning. Next is the trial path, where they are tested to see if they are worthy to become the Mane by facing several trials. The first of the trial paths is the trial of cleansing, a trial where the Lunar Champion should be cleansed of all doubts and regrets of the past with the help of a guide of their past, a spirit who will return to help them as they navigate their doubts and regrets of the past. The second trial of the trial path has something to do with understanding their people and understanding the present and how the world arrived where it is by the time that they become Mane. And the third trial is the path to the next path that they have to walk in life. So that's the path to the 2 moons path, as it's called, which is the final path, and in a way is a trial in itself, as the final path, the 2 moons path, essentially give them a glimpse into the possible futures that they must work to prevent in their upcoming time as Mane by transporting them temporarily to the moon realms, which we'll go into a little bit more later. Now at this point in the story, Shazza and Kali's life paths have been completed and they must now face the trial path. You as the player get the title of Moon Hallowed, which is essentially a figure blessed by the past Manes in order to help the Lunar Champions overcome their trials, and as such you get to witness their trials. Shazza in her first trial is met by the ghost of her father, who guides her in confronting the fears of her past, those being the victims of the Knaten flu, while Kali has her mother as her spirit guide to confront her reckless anger against the Imperials for taking away her mother. In the end, both pass their first trial, having let go of the past fears and regrets, and they are ready to move on to the second trial in a different temple across the province. Unfortunately, the remainder of the trials are interrupted by Javad Tarn and his Darkspawn, including the Dark Mane, who infests the second trial at Moonmont Temple, this time as a spirit and not as someone possessing someone. This results in them having to fight through the temple and release the grid that Javad and his forces have on the temple, and then being ambushed eventually by the Dark Mane upon reaching the central chamber of refraction. The Dark Mane then ensnares the Lunar Champions, and you as the player have to fight him to free them. Of course, you being the player, win, and just before the Dark Mane can escape, the spirit of the first Mane, who we talked about before and has appeared here and there during your adventure, appears and uses his magic to bind the Dark Mane temporarily. The spirit of the first Mane then reveals that there's no way to get rid of the Dark Mane unless he's killed outside the mortal plane, which is not an option now. And that for the time being he needs to be held in place, locked up in the central chamber of the temple to prevent further corruption of the province. And the first Mane also reveals that unfortunately only a Mane Khajiit can hope to bind the Dark Mane, and as such a choice needs to be made. Either Shazza or Kali needs to remain behind, locked away in the temple to keep the Dark Mane at bay, while the other sister needs to go out to the surface to claim her destiny as main. The choice is yours to make as Moon Hollowed, the first main says, and you are then faced with the choice of who has to stay behind and who will become main. When speaking to the sisters, each wants to stay behind and let the other become main. Kali says that Shazza should become the main as she knows much more of religious matters and does not have the physical strength to keep the Dark Main at bay, and that deep down she knew that her parents would have always wanted Shazza to be the main, since her father was always so proud of Shazza. Meanwhile, Shazza wants Kali to become the main, as between the two of them, Kali is the better leader, she's braver and she's a fighter, and she thinks that her parents would have always wanted Kali to be the main, because her mother was always so proud of Kali, and she thinks that it's better to choose her to stay behind, since she thinks she's better prepared to fight against the Dark Main, because she knows far more about the weaknesses about the Dromatra and the Dark Main. In the end, it's up to the player. Me personally, I picked Shazza to be the main, simply because it's the main's role to be a sort of spiritual leader, and she seems to be far more fit for that than Kali. But it's interesting to see how both of them desperately want the other to become main, as both are insecure on whether or not they are right for the job, and both want to save the other from torment while fighting with the Dark Main. No matter what choice you make, one of the sisters has to stay behind in the sealing chamber, and the other will emerge with you to face the final path, the path of the two moons, after which she swears to save her sister somehow from the sealing chamber after becoming main. But, surprise, Javad Tarnas besieged the city of Dune, the city where the two moons path is supposed to start, and just like he interfered with the last trial, he's interfering with this one. Now, as you work to get his troops and Daedra out of the city, you discover that Javad Tarn is once more planning to interrupt one of the main's paths. You see, the final path of the main's ascension, the path of two moons, is actually the path of the three moons, because the Khajiit religion holds that Nirn has a third dark moon, a moon that only the Khajiit can observe when the two moons align, and that's why mains are often referred to as the ones born under the dark moon. Now, in this image from the Elder Scrolls Online, we can actually faintly see this third moon just behind the moon masser. Can you see it, that silhouette? Anyway, the Khajiit legend holds that this third dark moon is the dead, rotting body of the god Lorkhan, or Lorkash as they call him. Now, whether or not that's true, we don't know, but we do know that the final path in becoming a main, the Two Moons path, has the main prospect travel to the third dark moon by first trekking across the moon Masser, or Jode in the Khajiit religion, and then making the jump through a portal to the dark moon. Across this journey, the main prospect gets to see glimpses of the future, usually glimpses of what would happen if they would not become main and do not dedicate themselves to the new role of main properly. In the case of Shazza and Kali, you will see the Altmeri Dominion fracturing. Elsewhere is more or less destroyed in this future, and it leads to the Bosmer activating the Wild Hunt because of the invading alliances, and Queen Irene being disposed and almost assassinated by traitors. So yeah, no pressure for your future role as main. Unfortunately, the trek across the final path does not go very smoothly either, because just before Shazza or Kali is able to enter the portal at June, through which only the prospective mains may pass, which begins the path to the Dark Moon, Javad Tarn, the enemy, goes in ahead of you to interrupt the ritual and walk the path himself. You then go in after him, and while you're able to walk the first part of the path normally with Shazza or Kali, on the Dark Moon you're ambushed by Javad and the Dark Main, who has won against the sister who was left behind and now possesses her body as well. This is the final battle of the questline, and you and the future main have to fight against Javad Tarn and the possessed body of the other sister. In this encounter, you're forced to kill both Javad Tarn and the other sister. While nobody cries for the loss of Javad Tarn, unfortunately the other sister has to be killed in order to be rid of the Dark Main. You see, the Dark Moon is located outside of the mortal plane, so killing the sister while she is possessed by the Dark Main would lead to the Dark Main also being destroyed. Fortunately, the soul of the killed sister is saved by the spirit of the first main, who will bring her soul to the sands behind the stars, where her parents also rest after an emotional goodbye with the living sister, who will have to return to the mortal plane in order to become the new main of Elsewhere. When you emerge back to the mortal plane with the evils of the questline vanquished, the sister you chose, in my case Shazza, will become the new main of Elsewhere, ushering in a new era for the Khajiit under an all-new main. And that was the story of the Lunar Champions, which plays in the background of the majority of the Elder Scrolls Online's Reaper's Marsh questline. Now, in my opinion, it's a pretty good questline. A bit grindy for my liking, but the story is definitely good. Even though it opened up a massive plot hole when we went to Elsewhere proper in the Northern and Southern Elsewhere DLCs, where they couldn't show the main anywhere during the questline and everything was just handled by their speaker, because 1/3 of people went for Shazza, the other third went for Kali, and an even bigger third in modern day ESO never even did this questline, and for them Akasri is still the main. So yeah, cool questline, but it's kind of annoying that it had that kind of effect. But it's still worth it for how fun this questline was, and for how good the Elsewhere DLC questlines were, I don't really have much to complain. I would have loved to see Shazza or Kali returning though, maybe at the end of that questline, but hey, that's just me. Now, that being said, I truly hope that you enjoyed this video and that I managed to teach you something new about the Elder Scrolls lore today. And if I did, why not subscribe to the channel and return for the next lore video, probably next week. Would really help me out if you subscribed. Now, all that remains for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon subscribers, Mr. Bernardo Binda, His Soul, Gabriel Binda, Athena Iodis, Doji, Fenrir, King Chris, Pavel T, Bentham Gwar, Volkir of Argonia, Leo Worley, and Sword of Bushido. They and all the others on screen keep this channel alive, and for that I'm eternally grateful. That said, I will see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.